Thanks, Justine. I'm Robyn Annear, and welcome. I can't see you. I hope you can see and hear us well. Thank you, Justine, for giving us some background to the Shenandoah story. I'm going to give you just a little more detail so that we can have a meaningful discussion from there, and so you can get an idea of why this is an important object for the State Library and for the people of Victoria. The CSS, that stood for Confederate Steamship Shenandoah, was a full-rigged ship with auxiliary steam power, captained by a Confederate Navy lieutenant, as we're going to call him tonight, because we're in the South for the evening, or in the US for the evening. Commander James Ritale. The Shenandoah has often been called a warship, but as Justine rightly said, it was more properly a commerce raider, so her aim was really to cripple the Union's maritime commerce, particularly that whaling trade, which was not just lucrative but vital for the oil it produced. For just over a year during 1864-5, that ship went right around the world, conducting commerce raiding that resulted in the capture of those 38 Union merchant vessels, many of them whale ships. And yes, the Shenandoah did fire the last shot of the American Civil War and was had the last sovereign Confederate flag to be furled. Certainly not the last Confederate flag to be furled, though, to be officially furled. Now, I've watched the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War twice, once just recently. That epic documentary series, The Civil War, but this aspect of the war came as complete news to me. During 1863, Confederate Navy officers were stationed in Europe to await the covert purchase of merchant vessels for modification, by which I mean they would be armed, and service on the high seas as commerce raiders for the Confederacy. Now, some called what they did piracy, and their officers buccaneers. And it seemed as if there were times when even the Shenandoah's own officers questioned the value to the cause of their activities and wished they were closer to the front, back amid the real fighting. Now, the reason that ships like the Shenandoah had to be acquired covertly was that Britain, among others, had sworn to maintain a just and immovable neutrality towards the parties engaged in the American Civil War. It was essentially unlawful to give aid to either side's war effort. This meant unlawful, say, for a British citizen to join the crew of either a Union or Confederate warship, or for a British colony to give beyond basic aid to such vessels, or likewise to obstruct them. Now, in January 1865, thank you, Justine, the Shenandoah arrived in Melbourne in need of substantial repairs. Already she'd captured 6 of those prizes, as they were called. 5 of them were burned after crew, passengers and useful supplies, in particular the much prized chronometers, had been taken on board the Shenandoah. 1 ship was bonded and used to transport prisoners to the closest port for their release. The Shenandoah had begun its voyage with a skeleton crew and signed up a number of crewmen on surprisingly attractive terms from among those they'd taken captive. But she was still severely short-handed when she anchored in Melbourne. Now, remember, Victoria was a British colony, and the Shenandoah was not permitted to recruit British citizens, nor could they enlist. The Victorian authorities were put on the spot by the Shenandoah's request to make use of port facilities at Williamstown in order to carry out the repairs. And it seems that local sentiments, even at a government level, were torn between Union and Confederate causes. Melbourne's US consul petitioned hard against rendering any assistance to the Shenandoah. In fact, he wanted her seized as a pirate. Instead, the ship's officers were granted free rail passes, and during their stay, and were feted among others by among others members of Parliament at the Melbourne Club. And thousands, in fact tens of thousands of locals visited the ship in the bay. Whatever else she was, the Shenandoah was a novelty. The ship was allowed to use the dry dock at Williamstown for its repairs and also to refuel and reprovision, but a police watch was put on her to prevent any locals from joining the crew. Suspicions arose that local sailors had been secretly recruited and smuggled on board, and a police raid was ordered. When the Shenandoah's commander refused to allow police aboard, the government called a halt to the ship's repairs and threatened to impound. In fact, some say they did impound the Shenandoah, but Commander Ritale called their bluff, declaring the threat an act of war. The repairs were hastily completed, and the Shenandoah sailed, or did she steam, away. Remarkably, once she was outside Port Phillip Heads, you won't be surprised to hear, 40 stowaways emerged from below decks, the 40 being the exact number needed to bring crew to capacity. With a full crew and in good repair, the Shenandoah headed for the North Pacific whaling grounds and would take another 32 prizes, including more than a third of the US whalers working the Bering Sea, before her crew learned at the beginning of August that the war had ended in May, the Confederacy having lost. 25 of the Shenandoah's captures had post-dated the fall of the Confederacy. After the Shenandoah surrendered at Liverpool, England in November 1865, most of her officers went into exile until such time as the US government pardoned or forgot about them. 6 years later, Britain would be required to pay the US government £820,000, or about $1.5 million in those times, damages for allowing the Confederate commerce raider Shenandoah the use of port facilities at Melbourne in 1865. So it was a pretty expensive visit for the British government. Now, that's the background. What's important for us to know, really, is that Lt Dabney Scales, Dabney Minor Scales, which is a funny name, Dabney Minor Scales of Mississippi was one of the Shenandoah's 9 naval officers. I think it was 9. He turned 24 in 1865 aboard the Shenandoah. He kept a diary on board, as did others of the officers, and the volume of that diary, which the State Library hopes to purchase, commences on Valentine's Day, 14th of February, 1865, with the Shenandoah under police surveillance at Williamstown, and goes on to give an account of the ship's heroic or piratical career right up to the end of her voyage. That's the background. Now, I want to begin tonight's conversation by asking Jo Ritale, the State Library's Head of Collections, to tell us about the diary as an object of significance and how it came to be available, a bit more detail about what it is. But first, James Saunders is going to give us just a taste of the diary's opening pages.
Confederate States steamer Shenandoah, cruising for Yankees. March 23rd, 1865, at sea, South Pacific. My last blank book, containing my journal from 1864 to 13th of February 1865, gave out today, and as I had no other, Grimball kindly offered me this one, captured with the Yankee whaling bark Edwards off Tristan da Cunha. At present, I'm very much behind with my journal and am now copying from notes made at Melbourne. The last page of my other volume leaves the ship on the Peyton Slip at Williamstown, near Melbourne, Australia. On the afternoon of the 13th, while Whittle, the senior officer, and the captain were ashore and Grimball was in charge, a police officer came on board with a warrant for the arrest of one Charlie, who he alleged was shipped on board and acting in the capacity of the ship's cook. Grimball assured him that there was no such man on the articles. Furthermore, that we knew the law on the subject and had shipped no one since the ship had been in English waters. I got the ship's articles and showed them to him that there might be no room for doubt on the subject. He then asked if he might take a look to see if the man was forward among the crew. This, of course, Grimball peremptorily refused, saying that our flag covered Confederate soil, and that so soon as he set his foot upon the deck of the vessel, he was no longer upon English but Confederate territory. He seemed considerably taken aback at this, and said that he could only await further instructions from Melbourne. At 5:00 p.m., a number of policemen, armed, and soldiers of the Volunteer Corps filed into the shipyard, marched down to the ship, and sentinels were then posted along the wharves on each side. An order was given at the same time to all the workmen to knock off working on the ship. The lessee of the slip was notified that the government had taken possession of it and prohibited any steps being taken toward launching the ship. It was thought by some on board that a forcible attempt to search the ship would be made. It was canvassed among the officers what course we would pursue in this event. I can't say it was discussed, for all who expressed an opinion in the matter were in favor of resisting to the last extremity. Of course, in our helpless condition, In case artillery was brought to bear on the ship, we would have to haul down the flag and surrender the vessel to the colonial government. I deplored the event that would force us to give up the vessel. The more so as I knew that this was just the thing for which the Yankee faction on shore was working. To put an end to the cruise of the last pirate would immortalize them in the eyes of the Yankee government.
There you go. He admitted it, the last pirate. Thank you, James. Now, Jo, tell us a little about the background of this presumably long-lost Shenandoah diary and describe what it is.
Well, I just want to say thank you, James. That was a fantastic way to, I guess, illustrate what a wonderful resource the diary is. I think, you know, from a library perspective, in terms of the background to how we came to find out about the diary, we are very fortunate. We have a fantastic community of booksellers that we have great relationships with, and they do a wonderful job for us identifying resources that we just, you know, don't have the capacity to always identify ourselves. And so we were very lucky that we had somebody who was able to recognise that this was, you know, such a significant item representing quite an important event in Melbourne's history, and was in a position to be able to acquire it and bring it back to Australia and offer it to the library. The library is obviously very keen to collect original historical documents that capture significant events in Melbourne, Victorian and Australian history. This one is of national significance. It isn't just a Melbourne story. And having something that you know, is uniquely representative of that, just that one episode of Australia's link with what is a global event, the American Civil War, is, you know, was a very exciting thing to be, you know, involved in, and to have the opportunity to purchase it. Diaries are something that we have a lot in our collection. We like to have that personal account of events. So, you know, there are lots of published accounts, there are newspaper reports, there are official histories, but to actually have someone's personal recollection and written at the time, that personal experience of that event, it brings a totally different perspective. And to actually have the American perspective of the you know, the visit in Melbourne, we have all the newspaper reports and the Melbourne experience, but to have you know, the officers' experience is really interesting, as you just heard.
Yeah, exactly. It's certainly not just a blank account. It's full of colour and personality and a real sense of Dabney Scales and life on board the Shenandoah during its Melbourne stay. Now, Angus Curry, the fact that you've written a book entitled The Officers of the CSS Shenandoah suggests to me that you're pretty well placed to tell us something about Lieutenant Dabney Scales, both as an officer and as a man, and what it meant to be an officer aboard one of those ships.
Sure, thanks, Robyn. Certainly Dab, as he was known to his fellow officers, was a young man. As you said, he was 24 when he served on the Shenandoah. He came from a place called Holly Springs in Mississippi. His parents owned a plantation, and he was one of 7 children. Dab joined the US Navy. He entered Annapolis, the Naval Academy, in 1859, and resigned his commission when his state seceded at the start of the Civil War. Dab was a brave young man. He, on a couple of occasions during the Civil War, prior to him serving on the Shenandoah, he was cited for acts of bravery. He certainly saw a fair bit of action before he joined the Shenandoah. He was in command of 2 gun crews on 2 separate ships in battle. Many of those men in his gun crews were killed and wounded during the conflict. And then in 1862, he was sent to Europe. And like a number of Confederate officers, they were sent there to man some of the warships that the Confederate Navy was secretly building or purchasing maritime ships over there to arm as cruisers. And he spent about 18 months in Europe before he was actually given orders to join this covert ship.
And they really chafed, didn't they, those young officers waiting, cooling their heels in Europe, waiting for a ship?
Oh, absolutely. There's a real sense of inertia for the officers, and they really wanted to serve their country. They knew that they were doing an important service, but when you were shunted off to a small part of France, in the case of Scales, just waiting, trying not to draw attention to yourself in case the US government recognised that you were a Confederate officer, getting onto a ship like the Shenandoah was a considerable relief, and why also that, as many of the officers on the Shenandoah, they didn't want to be thwarted when they finally got going. And when it came to confronting the colonial authorities, they didn't want to end their cruise just 2 or 3 months into the voyage. They wanted to keep going.
Angus, you've read the diaries and the published accounts by others of the Shenandoah officers. Your book shows you've gone into that in a big way. What's different in Dabney Scales' diary? What's new to you, if anything?
Look, it just overall broadens our understanding of what the officers went through. In terms of the context of Melbourne, there is a few excerpts in the diary that certainly reveal that the officers were well aware that there were stowaways on board. The Charlie that was mentioned earlier in the excerpt, Scales actually admitted that he knew that individual was on board and had been for 3 days. They knew that these people were on board. They were supposed to do a nightly check and make sure anyone who wasn't belonging to the ship's company was off the ship. And obviously they overlooked certain individuals. But it was a real first admission of any of the Confederate officers in journals or diaries, which were highly censored, self-censored, that they were aware that there were stowaways on board.
Terry, I've got a question for you next, but first, I want to talk to you about the nature of the public interest and sentiment in Melbourne that the Shenandoah met with. But first, I'm going to ask James again, just to give us a flavour of the local press coverage, and you can help us elaborate on that.
The arrival of the Confederate ship of war, Shenandoah, has created quite a stir among those who dwell on the margin of fair Hobson's water. All Melbourne is in a perfect twitter of excitement at the visit of this stranger, and for the time her officers are raised to the pedestal of demigods. Scott's Hotel, where these gentlemen have put up, is now the brightest point of attraction in the metropolis, and large assemblies crowd around the doors of that fashionable resort in hopes of getting a sight of these heroes of the main. From all accounts, the Shenandoah is a very miserable representative of the class to which she assumes to belong, the vessels of war. She is described as a craft built rather for running away than for fighting. And the only glory that is claimed by her commander as a result of his cruise is the sinking of some unarmed merchant vessels, the seizure of their chronometers and other valuables, and the capture of a few non-bellicose passengers. We look upon the mission as degrading to the profession of arms and not sufficient to warrant us in lionising those who are the selected instruments for the performance of the dirty work of war. That's from the Mount Alexander Mail. To the editor of The Age. Sir, they are pirates in every sense of the word, freebooters, if you like, appropriating to their own use other men's goods and destroying that which they cannot. As such, let them be regarded. Let no sympathy be shown them, and let us treat them with the indifference which their inglorious occupation deserves. Signed, a neutral Englishman. As to the merits of the quarrel between North and South, Each British subject is, of course, entitled to form his own opinion. But as a community, it is obviously our duty to abstain from taking either the one side or the other. The warfare in which this particular ship is engaged, if not the most heroic that can be imagined, is nevertheless perfectly legitimate. And to represent our visitors of today as pirates and buccaneers is simply to mistake the case. That's the Ballarat Star. To the editor of the Argus. Public opinion on the subject of our visitor, the Shenandoah, has been for the moment gravely misrepresented. It rarely happens that 10 Englishmen assemble together and light as a topic of conversation upon the great American contest without 9 of the 10 expressing feelings of hearty sympathy with the Southerners in their gallant, protracted, and thus far successful struggle against a gigantic invading power. Here, sir, we have an indication of the opinion of the community on this subject, identical with the one we find echoed in the parlours and cafes and at street corners throughout the city. And this is from The Age. If these men have a country to struggle for, why do they not fight instead of plunder? We would back a raft with a single gun and a dozen Williamstown volunteers to put the Shenandoah, chronometers and all, underwater in less than 20 minutes.
Thank you, James. And Terry, the newspapers of the day, among other things, tell us that steamers plied between the railway pier at Port Melbourne and the Shenandoah anchored in the bay, conveying some thousands of sightseers every day. A return ticket cost $1. And on the day of their departure, there were photographs of both the Shenandoah and Commander on sale at Collins Street Photographers. What are your impressions about how officials, both public and sympathies rather, both public and official, ran in Melbourne at the time?
Well, for a start, it was a novelty, a great novelty. The ship itself was a novelty. It was a hybrid sailor steamer, and it was the state-of-the-art, fastest thing afloat, some said, when it was the old Sea King, the original ship. It could sail under full sail. It could also lower the propeller and sail under steam, in which case it was able to outrun any whaler or merchantman, any Yankee that it chased. So even before, when it sailed through the heads, they initially thought it was a British merchant ship. When they found out it was a Confederate States ship, before it even anchored, the shore was lined with thousands of people who'd come to see it. One of the officers said, "The population of Melbourne, I think, is 180,000. I think they're all here." And people came out in rowboats and launches and lighters, and they tried to get aboard, and they asked for permission. The ladies particularly wanted to come aboard, and they let them. And one of the officers wrote, if we'd made them pay a toll to come aboard, we could pay off the Confederate debt. Very popular. Dinner at the Melbourne Club, a ball at Ballarat. Lots of soirees and meetings in the foyers of the Royal Theatre, and Scott's Hotel became the place to meet. And the ladies often acquired a gold button from the Confederate officer's uniform. Meanwhile, the ordinary seamen were disporting themselves in Burke Street and some of the streets in those days that still had a brothel in every corner. Yeah. But it was, it's 14 years since Victoria was separated from New South Wales. The arguments are all about protectionism versus free trade, similar to the arguments in the antebellum United States, and lots of rivalries between the states here. The argument's fairly similar, except for the issue of slavery, which most people didn't account as an issue at all. It was about states' rights. Australia was no more enlightened about slavery than anywhere else, than Britain or even the northern states of America. So it was something different. These were colourful characters. I don't know how many of them read the Age and how many read the Argus, but the Argus was sort of like maybe the Herald Sun of its day, and most people, the spirit of Eureka was still abroad. They were the underdog. This is the last year of the war. Sherman has started his march to the sea. Things are looking bad for the South. So they're the underdog. Australians love the underdog. Yeah. And particularly Victorians in those days. More Victorians went off to the Maori Wars than anywhere else. You know, they loved the foreign war. Yeah. It was an adventure, it was a stunt. So when these guys arrived, they were fated. But how much of it was political, ideological support for the Southern cause and how much was just novelty, I don't think we'll ever know. I think a bit of both.
It's a good point you make, the drawing that comparison between North and South in America and state rivalries and free trade arguments and so on here, because the rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne, as it was thought of, was foundational for
Well, they couldn't even
Victoria.
agree on a railway gauge, could they?
No,
let alone,
but for Victoria, I always felt that Victoria has identified itself, or Melbourne has identified itself from the start as not Sydney. That's been its identity. So you're right, I can see why there might be a strong streak of identification.
The Confederates, as they wandered around Melbourne, and would have heard similar arguments they would have heard in their youth about protectionism versus free trade, because those terms were invented by Southern slavers.
Yes, yeah.
So, you know, they would have been a lot different, but a lot that was awfully familiar too.
Just one question, Jo, do we have any of those buttons in the State Library?
We don't have any Confederate buttons, but that practice of giving buttons as a memento is, we certainly do have other examples in the collection.
Well, let's put out a call. Next time you're doing the publicity rounds, and anybody who's here tonight, if you have one of those in your family chest, the State Library would love to have it as a complimentary item to this diary.
There'd be a bit of Confederate DNA floating around Victoria.
I dare say. What do you think about how do you feel sentiments ran? Do you echo Terry's
very
impressions?
Much. It's actually hard to pinpoint, you know, as Terry said, how many people were genuinely in favour of the Confederate cause. But like Terry said, this was a novelty, a terrific novelty, and a sensation. So whether you agreed or not, people were riveted by the fact that this representation of a war that everyone knew quite well, because the newspapers of Victoria at the time were covering the Civil War closely. That this wasn't just a distant conflict that had no impact. The Civil War in America was driving up prices of goods in Victoria and the other colonies in Australia as well. So there was actually a direct impact on the Melbourne community from the war between the North and the South. So these people, for whatever reason, they celebrated the officers coming, and they were intrigued that this representation of the South had arrived at their shores unexpectedly.
Yeah.
It's worth noting too that while all this Duchess thing was going on of these Confederate officers, an ad appeared in the Argus that said, "Wanted 2 or 3 respectable young men to make themselves useful to travel up new country. Apply Mr. Powell, 125 Flinders Lane today." This was secretly recruiting Marines and sailors for the ship.
So this is where the 40 stowaways came from.
This is where the supposed stowaways came from, yeah.
Victoria, Melbourne at the time, most of those blokes who'd come out to the gold rushes who were of gold rush age had missed out on a war. They'd been of fighting age, I guess, of prime fighting age, when the gold rush was their war, the equivalent to, was the highlight of their lives, and they would remember it ever after in the way other men might remember their war experience. So I can see why they were drawn to warriors and to the idea of fighting.
Also, the gold rush was on the wane, you know.
Oh yeah, sure.
Melbourne had emptied out of men during the gold rush. Now a lot of guys coming back with empty pockets and nothing to do, and this was a call to adventure, you know. And I'm sure a lot of those guys who signed up for the Shenandoah just wanted adventure.
I bet. Yes, you're right. So yes, it wasn't allegiance so much as adventure. Now, Terry, you've written a book too about the Shenandoah called Australian Confederates. And probably, I don't know, I guess you felt that you knew everything there was to know about the story. You've read the diary. What do you think? Are the breakthroughs for you in that? Is there new information?
There was new information. I didn't know about the cousin.
I think we can put that cousin in inverted commas. We'll tell you about that in a moment.
Yeah. What impressed me was what happened when they found the war, they discovered the war was over in August, when they hauled over an English vessel called the Barracuda and were told that what they had previously thought was Yankee propaganda about Lee's surrender and the capture of Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, was all true. The war was over. They had to haul down the flag and put the guns away, stow the guns, and they realised then they'd sunk 15 more ships as pirates, not as a military force, and they would be they could be hanged. The Captain Waddell said, "Well, we'll sail around the world to avoid the Yankees," which is what they did. But in Dab Scales' diary, you see what happened to morale on that boat once they it really fell apart. Everybody falls apart. They're sniping at each other over petty things. It's quite enlightening. Yeah,
those relations on board. You went into this in great detail in your book, Angus. The relationships between the officers, and particularly the relationships of authority with the commander. I was interested to read Scales calling Commander Waddell the great Hidalgo, Pasha, Sultan, and the old he, among other things. And in the end, he said, "He is a man for whom I have such profound disgust." Things didn't go well, particularly after the end of the war was known.
No, certainly, and Scales and a number of the other officers did actually chafe against Waddell's command during the voyage, but when they learned that the war was over, they were in a very precarious position, obviously. Their future was uncertain.
Because they were pirates once they knew the war was over.
Well, certainly they'd committed acts of war outside the norms of conflict. They were in a position where also the structures of the command were completely uncertain. They were no longer a military force. They were still officers, but of what nation? So some of them started to do things and act in ways that they would never have done in the real Navy. So, then there were minor transgressions, oversleeping, smoking on the wrong part of the ship.
But oversleeping was punishable by death, I think.
It was a serious
offence.
As
a caution.
Yeah. But the structures of the command fell apart. And Waddell didn't even know how to punish the officers. At one point, he suspended Scales and said, "Well, you're no longer an officer on this ship. You are merely a passenger, and we're giving you a passage to the nearest port and letting you off," which was, all very well, but that left the officers short-handed. Who was going to cover Scales' watch? And other officers then rallied behind Scales and sort of said, well, you can't do that. Waddell then promoted another junior officer to take his watch, and that upset other officers who were more senior than him. And in the end, Waddell was faced with actually undertaking watch duties himself, which was unheard of a commanding officer. And he backed down and reinstated Scales in his position as a lieutenant. But
it all got rather petty, didn't it?
It did get rather petty, and this comes down to the officers were highly conscious of their sense of honour. If they felt that their honour was being transgressed in any way, that got their backup. There was a couple of near duels on board the ship between some of the officers. It just really, the morale collapsed, yes. and there were some issues that occurred in the voyage that remained for decades afterwards between the officers, and some of them never spoke to each other again.
Yeah, it's really fascinating just to read this in Scales' diary, to read the end of a war coming the way it did in the middle of the ocean, like a thunderclap to them, and just how all the air was let out of their world. It's quite shocking and a really sad read, that part of it, because they were in such high spirits before that, claiming prizes left and right, weren't they? Jo, I know we don't have any Confederate buttons in the collection, in the State Library's collection, but Do we have any other items? Now, we talked about newspapers relating to telling the stories of the Shenandoah in Melbourne, but do we have any other sort of Civil War related items, or are we interested in more?
Well, it's obviously it's not something that we have a huge strength in our collection, not being a Victorian event. We have some official publications, some published histories. We have this rather interesting collection which we call the autograph collection. I don't know, some of you may have heard about that. It's a collection that Redmond Barry, who was our founding father, as we like to think of him, he kind of made an effort to collect signatures of important people. So we've got some signatures of some of the key players in the Civil War. So, and I'm not a Civil War expert, so I hope I don't get any of the names wrong. But people like Robert E. Lee, who was a Confederate officer, quite important. Stonewall Jackson, I think. I'm going to really struggle here and really show my lack of knowledge of American history.
But some Civil War related.
But not
autographs.
particularly. The items that we have, the correspondence doesn't particularly relate to the Civil War, but they're letters by those individuals, and obviously now with this diary. But no, we don't actually have a lot, and there isn't a lot elsewhere in Australia. So this will be a fairly unique item. Yeah.
And all the more so if we can get that button. So ask all your friends. I was interested. Well, you made a mention just before, Terry, of the cousin. The supposed female cousin or cousins that Dabney Scales seems to have discovered in Melbourne. Now, there's some question about how facetious he was being about them being cousins. What do you think?
I'm going to pass it over to Angus.
Look, he mentions a cousin, F, he calls her.
Is this news to you?
News to me as well.
Yeah.
And certainly in his diary, Scales indicates that he suspects that she isn't actually a distant relative at all. But he goes into no further detail. But he has these little snippets of information in here that certainly we weren't aware of before. He talks about a Monsieur X, someone on board the Shenandoah, and talks about how they got into an assault on shore, and Scales had this tendency of when he was saying something either salacious or saying something that he didn't want to reveal, he sort of wrote down in this kind of strange French. When he wanted to conceal something.
He was later a teacher of French. Was the French in the diary good French?
I don't speak French, and my Google translator does not do it justice at all. So whether it doesn't translate something in the 19th century French or not, but certainly when he wants to conceal something, or he was quite angry about something, he breaks into French.
French, yes.
There were a few barroom brawls that other officers reported on me. Dab doesn't, but yeah.
Dab doesn't mention them. This F, I scouted around a bit. There seemed to be quite a few chapters of the Scales family, not his Scales family necessarily, but Scales families here in Melbourne at the time, including one branch in Williamstown, so near where the ship was in dry dock. And they had a daughter named Fanny, who was of the right kind of age. She married a year after the Shenandoah sailed, and had a baby very soon thereafter. Too soon.
Someone should check her glory box for buttons.
Exactly, check that glory box for buttons. So I wouldn't be surprised if but her family were Irish. Her father and mother were both Irish born, so it was in name only that they were cousins. If she was the F in question, and she certainly had a sister to whom he also referred. But they exchanged photographs, I think, and she gave him a valentine on the day that his diary begins. So, there was a fair bit of fondness.
Well, it's an unusual name, so there's not going to be too many of them around.
Yeah, so I think possibly they came out to the boat. She came out to the boat with her family and said, "My name's Scales too." And they struck
come
up
aboard,
a friendship.
madam.
Yeah, exactly. Lift your leg up here. There were women who fell between the two, the ferry and the Shenandoah, I believe, and with crinolines and all, and had to be fished out of the drink. And they did go over, not the women necessarily, but everybody went over every inch of the ship, as you say. It's almost as if they were looking for stowaways at that stage, thinking of being stowaways themselves, because some of the officers, including Dab, I think, remark on how they couldn't get rid of them. They went through, through their underwear drawers just about.
The recruits were hiding in the bowsprit and the water tanks all over the place, and the bilge.
Some quite dangerous spots those stowaways were stowing. And in Melbourne, as you say, in Melbourne at the time, there wasn't a lot happening. It was a bit of a downtime between the gold rush and when Melbourne became marvellous. I looked to see what else was happening in Melbourne that year. The Burke and Wills Monument was unveiled later in the year, and that would have drawn almost as big a crowd as the Shenandoah, I dare say, because people loved turning out to farewell Burke and Wills, as many times as you wanted to throw a party, I think. And the E.W. Cole opened his first book arcade at the Eastern Market that year, and that proved a popular sensation. So, so there was a bit happening, but, you could open an envelope and people would show up in Melbourne. If you laid a foundation stone, that was very exciting. Often because they put on free food and grog, I think, and people would turn up for that. I loved some of the things that they took from their prizes. The chronometers we've mentioned, and they were very disparaging if the chronometer was not a good chronometer. Why did they want what is it about a chronometer? What was the deal? Do we know?
They were very expensive, and the idea was at the end of the war they would cash them in. They would cash them in, and those ships that they captured would then owe the Confederacy that the debt of the worth of the things that were taken.
Oh, wow.
And look, certainly what they usually took off the ships was enough supplies to keep the ship going. I mean, the reason why the Shenandoah was able to stay at sea for 13 months was because of the ships that they would take, which often didn't have anything like wealth or money, but they were able to take dry goods, they were able to take stocks of food. That allowed the ship to only go to shore or only go to a port once during those 13 months. And especially one of the things they were able to take off were tinned goods as well, which was quite a new product, but again, food that kept for a long time enabled the Shenandoah to make this amazing journey, circumnavigating the world
barely touching land.
Yeah.
Because don't forget, most of those ships they sank. They set fire to.
That's right.
And scuttled a couple.
And they loved a fire.
Loved
didn't
a good
they?
fire at sea.
They loved a fire. God, gee, they had some fun. They took a lot of liquor off those ships too, did they not?
Yes, liquor, a bit of trouble there with but particularly the Australian recruits got them into a bit of trouble with the liquor that was taken aboard, but and weapons too were taken. But
I think the officers and the crew were not supposed to take things for their own use. Am I correct?
Yeah, but
they did.
Old Dab actually got into trouble at one point. He got suspended because of one of the whalers. He took a beaker of spirits and hid that in another officer's room, and he got found out. Now, that in itself probably wouldn't have been a problem, but this particular whaling ship that they captured was stuffed full of liquor. They were using it to sell to the Eskimos for other goods, and it led to a 3-day bender for the crews of the Shenandoah.
Entire ship, yeah.
It was really hard to retain order and return to order after that one.
On a more sober note, they also they also assembled a library of good books from their prizes. So Dab talks about seemed to be reading the entire works of Charles Dickens at one stage when things were quiet. Pickwick Papers and David Copperfield got a mention. Walter Scott's Marmion, and I thought it was very sad. After learning of the war's end, he took to reading The Last Days of Pompeii and said, "I no longer have a country to serve, no longer a flag to defend or appeal to for protection." And the last days of Pompeii seemed to fit his mood, apparently. Now, what do you two think is the significance of this Shenandoah diary? And, as students of the Civil War, how do you feel about it being, so far from home? Is Melbourne a good place for it?
yes, well, it's the only place in Australia that has any connection, direct connection with that conflict. It's the ideal, it's the only place. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Look, absolutely. We do have a range of sources in Melbourne. The State Library has a range of sources about the Shenandoah's visit. The Public Records Office certainly has a lot about the diplomatic correspondence and the police investigations into the Shenandoah. And this diary really places a first-hand account of one of the officers and who was involved in this great diplomatic scandal that occurred in Melbourne. It's a fantastic resource to have here in Melbourne where those events took place. And these events weren't just important for Melbourne's history, but the ramifications in international law stretched on for a long, long time after that. So it's a wonderful resource to have at the State Library.
Mm.
You know, history can be a bit dry unless you put flesh on the bones, and what Dab's story does is do that. Is you get the personality of the man, you get who he likes, who he doesn't like, how he feels about different events. So these things are really, really valuable and really, really rare. So
I think so too. Yes, yeah, and you do get a sense of Melbourne in its time, even though we get a snapshot only of their last couple of days in port. You get a sense of what interested him about the place and how he saw it and the people here. So the Melbourne flavour of the story comes through even in just those few days.
Indeed.
You also get a sense of how Dab Scales felt about women in the diary. And so to finish up, James Saunders is going to favour us with a final excerpt from the diary, detailing one of the last social engagements of Dab ashore before the Shenandoah sailed or steamed away from Melbourne. Thanks, James.
Mr. White, a gentleman whose acquaintance I had made on board some days ago, invited another officer and myself to a little soiree at his house out at St. Kilder. The four of us drove up before the door of a nice little cottage, about 8 o'clock. We were ushered in by our host into the little parlor where a quadrille was just being formed. In our hostess, a good-looking woman of about 5 and 20, I recognized a lady to whom I had been very attentive in showing White's party around the ship. There were only about 6 or 8 ladies present, of whom I thought Mrs. W. the prettiest, most intelligent, and agreeable. Her sister, a Miss Hodgkinson, what's in a name, was present. Though not so pretty or intelligent as her sister, Miss H was lively, abounding in chaff and coquetry. The music was not very good for dancing, and the dancing, well, that is the gallops, which were rather jumped than danced, were not good for either music or dancers. About 12 o'clock, we had a nice little supper, after which followed a few more waltzes, gallopings, etc. And then we broke up at the reasonable hour of 2 o'clock. I got on board with only 15 minutes grace, 3:45, for my morning watch, during which I succeeded in keeping my eyes open, while the stevedores worked at the coal.
Thank you.